Hello everybody, Watson here to go over a quick game review with you. I'm going to go over some of my best games and my worst games of the week, and also do some analysis with it so that I can practice, doing analysis, because a lot of times we just skip over our games and don't really look at the things that we did wrong, and it gives me reason to look deeply into these games and see if there's something maybe I missed. So I played two rapid games. These are going to be longer games, at least 10 minutes long, with like 3 minutes increment. That way I had enough time to actually practice thinking during the game instead of just blitzing out moves. Before we get into that, more blindfold chess. There was one game I played earlier against just a computer that made random moves. And if you want to, instead of me, you see the board, but instead of me making the moves, I'll just say the words. And if you want to even practice even without even looking at the board, you can just turn away and I'll call out the moves, and that way you can fully visualize what's going on. It's just a quick 10-minute game or a 10 move game, so if you can keep up, this will be a good test for your blindfold skills. So I was white and I played e4. The computer played e5. Even though it plays random moves, it still played a king's pawn opening. So e4 and e5 have already been played. And while I was doing this, I didn't have any sort of board whatsoever. I couldn't even see the moves, so I had to remember the moves and the board. I would just type them in on like a pad or something. So it's a big help to have the board as well. So e4, e5. I played knight f3, just typical development move, attacking the e5 pawn. And the computer played g5, which struck me as weird. Of course, it's a weird move, and it's right now set to play random. And initially I thought, okay, I can take the pawn with the knight on e5, but then I didn't like queen e7, so instead I played the strongest move, d4. With d4, we're attacking e5, and at the same time we're attacking g5. The computer played b6, which unleashes the light square bishop but does nothing about the center. And here, instead of capturing the g pawn with the bishop, immediately I played d takes e5. For some reason I was thinking if bishop takes g5, then f6, and it would support the e5 pawn, and for some reason I didn't want to complicate things. I can show you afterwards, but just knight takes e5, and you can't take the bishop because of a mate in 4, which is kind of hard to see when you're playing blindfolded. But just to make things simple and to open up the lines for the queen on d1, I just captured to the center with e5. So d takes e5. So right now, if you want me to recap, we played e4, e5, knight f3, g5, d4, b6, d takes e5. And after d takes e5, the computer just made another random move, a6, which makes no sense really. And bishop takes g5, attacking the queen. And the computer played bishop g7. I played bishop takes queen. And instead of king takes queen, king f8. So I know it's hard to see because there's all of these complicated, or at least random moves, but black has a pawn on b6, a6. The g5 pawn was taken by the bishop before the bishop went to d8. The pawn on e5 got captured, so there's two pawns on e5, pawn on e5 and e4, and the bishop's on g7 for black, and black just played king f8. I played bishop on d takes c7, so bishop takes c7, which takes away the protector of the d6 square. And black played knight on g to f6, which falls right into the e5 pawn, which is right there, which can capture it on the next move. But instead, it's stronger to play queen d6 check first. And what is black going to do about the check? Well, he would like to go to g8. That's probably possible too, but probably just takes the knight, and the queen's going to get in. And after that, the bishop is also attacked on g7. So instead of that, after queen d6 check, just king e8, which I know it doesn't make sense either. Pawn takes f6. Pawn takes knight on f6. The e-pawn takes that, attacking the bishop. And what did black play here? E took f6, h6. All right. So h6 was played after pawn takes f6. Then h6 was played, which it does nothing to stop the next move, which you might see if you see what the position as I see it. You've got, if you look at black, the rook is still on a8, the knight is still on c8, the bishop's still, or sorry, the knight's still on b8, the bishop's still on c8, queen's gone, the king's on e8, the knight on f6 was traded for the pawn was gone, and black's bishop is still currently in attack by the pawn on g7, and the rook is on h8. So, and my pieces, nothing has moved except for my dark squared bishop, my queen, the d and e pawn, and the knight on f3 that's still there. So, and I've got a pawn on e5 that took on f6, and a pawn on e4. So if you see the next move, kudos to you, but it's just simply queen e7. And if you look at where the king can go, the king has nowhere to go, so this is actually checkmate. Alright, and for those of you that weren't able to see the position, or just to see it more clearly, I'll skip to the final position. And earlier, I'll just play through the moves first, but g5, d4, b6, d takes e5, a6, bishop takes g5, bishop g7, bishop takes d8, king f8, bishop c7, takes c7, knight f6, queen d6 check, king e8, pawn takes f6, h6, and queen e7 mate. And that earlier, where I was initially worried about, not this move, bishop takes g5, initially was worried about f6. Well, after f6, white has an astounding reply, knight takes on e5. And if you take the bishop, well, first off, if you take the pawn, the queen's just hanging because the bishop's there. So if you take the bishop, then it fails to queen h5 check, king e7 only move, queen f7 check, king c6 only move, knight c4 check, king c6 only move, and queen d5 check. So, of course, it's really hard to see all that blindfolded, but now that I've seen this pattern, if I see something like that again, hopefully I'll be able to calculate all that. And of course, it's easier when you have the board, but when you're just looking at blank space and you don't even have the moves in front of you, so you're trying to be as simple as possible so you can remember everything, it's not that surprising to miss all that. But it's just a 10-minute game to warm up, and let's jump into the first game that I played. So this was played online. It's a 10-minute game with 3 seconds increment against an unknown player, rated around 2100 on Lichess. So not by any means a weak opponent, not a master, maybe 1900 or 1800 FIDE chess rating. So an expert maybe, or a class A player. But this game, I had the white pieces and I played e4. Black responded e5, knight f3, knight c6. And we're already in very, very familiar territory. Bishop c4 could lead us into the Italian game. Bishop b5, the Roy Lopez. Um, c3 would lead us into the Ponziani game. There's a lot of different moves here. But the move played in the game was d4. And this is just trying to get into a sharp but solid approach. If black takes, which is mainly the move, if he decides not to take and, for instance, just defends the pawn with d6, then just simply d5 gains a lot of space. And since I haven't moved the bishop, the next move most likely is going to be c4. So that wasn't played. Instead, just the normal move takes on d4. And I initially thought, okay, am I going to play a Scotch Gambit with bishop c4? I'm going to play Goran Gambit with c3. Had some good games there before, but just to keep things solid, I played knight takes d4. And if I was playing this, a lot of times I would play queen h4 here, which very tactical variation, attacking this pawn, and then not even caring about if you take, because I'll take the pawn first with check, and then if queen blocks, this forces a trade of queens, and then I'll take on c6. So I like to play that variation a lot. A good move to play here would be either bishop f6 or knight f6 or even queen f6. These are all main lines here, in addition to queen h4. But what the opponent played in the game wasn't bad, but it's not at all good for black. Knight takes knight on d4. As you see, the computer gives it an interesting move or a dubious move, not really a good move at all, and then queen takes. And now we have 5 moves, and white has a pawn in the center and a queen to show for it, and black has nothing. Not a single piece developed. Everything's back at the home row. Only one bishop can move, whereas both white's bishops can come out to the center quickly. The knight can come to an active square on c3, and white is ready to castle either direction. Whereas black still has to make a few moves to get developed, and the pawn on e5 is already controlling the d5 square, and it can get pushed to e5 if black decides to go to f6. So all in all, black's doing pretty fine here, and immediately tried to gain space on the queen, sort of a dubious move, but played c5, which it doesn't seem to be a mistake. The computer shows here, which the computer is of course looking very deep and seeing how positionally wrong that move was because of weakening the dark squares and the backward d7 pawn and all that, and locking the square of the dark square bishop on f8. But for all of us here, it's not very easy to see why this is a mistake. The computer gives a few lines with queen e5 check, but I'm not really in the spirit of trading queens. And the natural move, bishop e3 or queen e3, also blocks that bishop, and then the other move is bishop d3. So one of those is clearly better than the others, and I played queen d3, which seems counterintuitive because it blocks the light square bishop, but it keeps the pressure on the d file. At the same time, it prepares white to castle queenside and supports the e4 pawn, while at the same time this bishop can come out, as you see in the next few moves. So instead of c5, black could have continued queen f6, which is normally what they would play here when they're trying to trade off all the pieces, with the knight takes on knight on d4, and then now they try to trade the queen as well, which of course we're not going to do, because at the end of the line black has a knight developed and we don't have anything developed except for the pawn on e4, which is under attack. So black would be totally fine here, but we just have a simple move, queen c4, and we're attacking the c7 pawn, so black reacts with bishop d6, and we just develop, and at the same time creating a threat of knight b5. And because of that threat, after knight c6, we are able to take on d6, queen takes, and we have the bishop pair. We still have an open e file, or semi-open d file for us, and we have lots of chances to make the queen move again, and our position is pretty active. So after bishop d2, we're preparing to castle. Black might play knight d5, but we're not too worried about that. We'll just move the queen back here, and we'll be x-raying the g7 pawn and perhaps ready to play f4 as well. So this did not happen in the game. After c5, queen d3, knight f6, and bishop g5, which computer gives us sort of an inaccuracy. It says knight c3 is better, and that's mainly to clamp down on the d5 square to stop any type of counterplay whatsoever from black. But at the same time, this is a sharp move, and black is forced to respond somehow because e5 is a threat here. So they responded with bishop e7, breaking the pin, and the normal developing move, knight c3, and then this bizarre looking h5, which doesn't do anything except cement the bishop on f4 and weakens even more the squares around the king side. And I can't criticize this move too much because I don't know exactly what the opponent was looking at. Maybe they're considering knight g4, but all in all, I just played f4, which a lot of times you might think, well, see, my opponent made a move, I'm just going to castle develop, but no, they wasted a move and I was able to play f4, a strong move, which supports the e5 push, cements the bishop on g5, and gets ready for further kingside expansion after we castle queenside. So our attack is already starting to roll, and black is left with a weakened kingside if he castles that way because of the h5 move. So black tried to free themselves a little bit, played knight h7 to try to trade bishops, which d6 would have been another option to just let the bishop get out, and I would castle and we would have a pressure on this d6 pawn, which if we were to go back, that is another reason why in this position knight c3 is preferred, because the d6 pawn is going to be so weak, and after this, in this line, we just take it and we literally just win the pawn for nothing. So slightly more accurate would have been knight c3 before, but this position is definitely fine for white. And here, just traded pieces and played the exciting knight d5, which the threat is just to go to c7, which computer gives an accurate. It just says castle right here. There's no reason to get aggressive, but this whole game we've been playing aggressive moves, getting black to run around and defend themselves, so we're trying to keep the pressure up as much as possible. So queen retreats back, and now queen c3, a very interesting move with the clear idea of taking the pawn on g7. And in fact, there's only really one move, castling, or there may be other moves, but castling is the best, and then we castle and continue with development with still a very strong pressure. All of our pieces, as you can see, this pawn is just hanging, ready to be taken. As soon as that pawn gets taken, these pawns are rolling, and even if without that pawn being taken, it's going to get rolling, and these files are going to open up, and there's going to be some serious attack against the king. So black reacted with knight f6, which in fact is a really huge blunder, but I didn't see it in the game and I just capsuled queenside. But instead, there's a winning move here, or it's very hard to see why it's winning right away, but it's a crushing move that takes advantage of the misplaced king and this knight here, and that's just simply queen e5 check. And the threat is simple. Queen, of course, can't block the check because then you just take it. So the king has to move. And after the king moves, you could play knight c7. And that's originally what I thought was the point of this move when I first saw it. But just queen goes in. And then if the king goes back, then yes, knight c7 is going to be really strong. So king has to keep going. And then we have knight into e7, and just look at how uncomfortable black's king is and how all our pieces are already attacking and it's just move 13 or move 15. So king has to move to h7, then e5, very strong move, kicking away the knight. And in fact, if the knight were to leave, for example, knight e5, then bishop d3 is very strong. And I can just continue the line for you just to show you how crushing white's position is here. And again, black couldn't take, because if black takes right away the bishop, it's just instant mate next move with queen takes g6. So he has to move to g7, and then knight f5 check, and we have this position here where just the quiet queen d5, the threat is just to take here, and there is no taking because of the pin. So black plays to rook to h7, defending the threat of mate, and we take, and you can already see that if king takes, then queen's going to take this on the next move, and this is already a crushing attack. And this line is not hard to see. Once you have this move played, queen e5, you've already broken casting rights. The next move kind of flow. It's very logical. The next move is a check. It gets the queen just a little bit closer to the king, and then after the king moves over, there's a knight just plops into e7, and then of course e5 is the next move that's easy to see. So really crazy miss here. I should have definitely seen that. Right now we're looking at the time. I have 10 minutes, so we've played fast enough in this position that neither side of us has gone below 10 minutes yet. We're still been playing this position really fast, instead of taking our time and really thinking about the moves. So castles, black castles, and we have queen takes c5. Very interesting move. Computer again gives e5, just simply starting to push back black's pieces and getting some space on the king side, and also prevent d6 from being played. But I played queen takes c5 and b6, just attacking the queen. And here there's a few moves you can play. The first one that comes to mind is queen d4, but this is more attacking. This is sharp. We're trying to be as aggressive as possible, and there's a very sharp move here that doesn't seem to work because of the obvious reply that shows up in the game, but it does work because of the line that was calculated, and that happened in the game. So knight e7 check, and you can imagine if this knight wasn't here, the queen would have to give itself up to take the knight, because on the next move after the king were to go to h8, there would be queen f5 or queen h5 checkmate if the knight wasn't there. So that's already another reason why the h5 was such a bad move early on in the game, because of the weakened position for the king. But knight e7, and what else are you going to do besides king h8? And then here the most accurate move is probably queen b4, queen e5, but or queen d6. But I played queen e5, which the computer doesn't like, because of the next move, rook e8, which I'm not gonna lie and say that I'd already seen this position perfectly, but I did see that this queen really doesn't have very many places to go, and so it falls to the next beautiful tactic, knight c6. And this kind of justifies the whole variation, because this whole maneuver, where's the queen going to go? Well, if you go to c7, we take the queen. If pawn takes, then the queen falls, and you can't take my queen because the rook's going to be pinned. So it forces the rook to take, unless I don't have the engine on, but there's probably not much else you can do here. Yep, checking the engine. The only move is rook takes e5, and then knight takes the queen on e8. And the rook's still under attack. I'll just go through the next moves. And at the end of this, we're up a pawn, which which black takes on the next move. But who has more of an active addition, who has more of a safer king, who has the pieces ready to be developed. Well, you have bishop c4 check, and now the rooks are connected. White has their pieces in the game, and White's king is kind of naked over there because of the h5 move earlier, and also the disjointed pieces. And I'm dreaming of a time that I could get a rook to the back rank and somehow mate the king, because of the fact that this bishop still hasn't developed and this rook is out of play. So really dominating position. Still only slightly better for White. Still have to play really well from here, but I'll play the next few moves. And here I'm trying to play as actively as possible, trying to get counterplay or trying to get play here. And here I attack the bishop, or the bishop attacks the rook on a8. Rook h to e1, and then black finally gets the last piece out because it was getting very dangerous with this rook intending to come here, and if that bishop was there, there might be even more threats. So the bishop moves to give space and allow the rook to defend the back rank. Rook comes to e7, check. King g8, and now interesting but dubious rook f7. And we're hoping, if I had all the time in the world, I would play this move and bishop c d5 and generate some threats. But and I'm trying to get a rise out of black. I'm trying to get black to make a mistake, trying to make black to do something. Right now the material is equal. We both have 5 pawns. It's completely equal when it comes to material, but black's king is not safe at all compared to white's king, and white has a better pawn structure. Instead of having these 3 pawn islands with each of them being weak, we have these 3 points together and these 2 pawns over here. So when it comes to structure, white is ahead there, and if you look at the evaluation, it's already 3.8. You can't see the evaluation, but it says that white is ahead. But the next move, rook f8, forces the rook away, and then they take on a2. And I was wishing that once that happened, I had bishop d5 to skewer, but you can't have everything. So king b1, attacking the rook. Rook goes to a4, and here the computer gives b3 and says, okay, look, you have a good position, and this line looks very good for white, which, again, I'm not really looking too deeply into this position. At this moment, after rook e4, I have 6 minutes, and my opponent has 4 minutes, and this still has plenty of increments, so there's a lot of time that we have, but not all the time in the world. But we spent quite a few minutes trying to find what to do next, and played a very interesting knight e4, which aims to get rid of the knight, and there's a lot of tactical reasons that I won't go into when it comes to what happens if knight takes or bishop takes or all that. But if knight takes, it seems that bishop takes, and then these pawns are going to be weak, and there's also a threat of check, and the knight's a big defender of the d7 pawn as well. So it was aimed against all those. Probably not the most accurate move, but a sharp move nonetheless. And I spent about at least over a minute thinking about that move, trying to come up with a plan to attack black and keep my advantage. Alright, so bishop b5, which doesn't seem to do too much, but it does defend the rook, which is a good thing. And then knight takes on f6, which computer says now this position is completely equal. There's nothing here, and the bishop defended d7, so that pawn is no more as weak as it was before. Rook takes, of course. Bishop d5 check. King f8, and rook to e1. And now, if I had an extra move, this would already be mate here. And black response wasn't the best. Played rook d4, which is instant. almost a loss right away. But there is a defense that's just really, really hard to see. And this line for me is very strong. Just starting with rook e8 check. King has to go to g7. The other rook comes in to e7. King goes to h8 or h6. And right now I'm already down to a minute because this whole exchange, I spent a lot of time thinking about trying to find a mate. And after this, I came up with h4, which cuts off the last defense or the last escape, and now threatens rook h8 mate. So rook f1, which makes my king leave, but at the same time, it might give the king some space to run this way. And after king a2, huge blunder. Probably the one that loses the game here would be rook a4, because the only move was actually g5, and it forces rook h8, king g6, and then if the king were to go back, there is a nice mate with here. So the king has to keep going. If the king were to go here, then and this position is actually mate as well. So this line would be forced, very forced. But unlike the variation in the game, black has sort of even material. Still not a very good position at all, but not totally lost. Instead, after rook a4, king b3, and now what do? g5, making space for the king. But at the end of this variation, which as opposed to the other variation, the rook is lost. And if this rook, the bishop were to take the rook on an f1, then the rook on a4 would fall. So not the best variation. And the next few moves, my opponent's already down to 10 seconds here. I have about 30 seconds, and he blundered very badly into this lost game here. And still fighting, still making moves. Right now I have 40 seconds. My opponent has less than 10 seconds. And I play this great move, bishop e4, which sets up a mate in a few moves, and by starting a discovered attack. The only problem is after b5, what I should have done would have been to take on a5. That way this pawn can still move freely, and there's less threats of a stalemate. But instead, after b5 check, I played rook takes b5 check, and the king goes back, and I give another check. Right now I have 46 seconds, my opponent has 7, so he's pre-moving this out, and I'm thinking, man, why don't you just resign? This is disgraceful. A check, and then check, and then the blunder of the game here that just ends the game on the spot. Not the better move. King takes a5, which would have forced the king to go there, and that would have been mate. But rook c7, and believe it or not, is actually stalemate. And it's not too hard to see why, because both pawns are stuck here, and this bishop that I strategically placed behind there to have a discovered attack is actually stopping the king from going to a8, and so the game ended in a stalemate. And of course, it's after such a game like that, it's really hard to lose confidence. You lose confidence a lot after you stalemate someone right there when you had a winning position, especially when right now I have 45 seconds and my opponent has only 8. If I had just taken a few seconds to see that that was going to be stalemate, I could have easily prevented it and played mate. So that, in my opinion, is my worst game of the week, or the most disappointing game, I should say, of the week, with that stalemate. But we live and we learn. Alright, the next game, it was actually a rematch against the same person. But this game, Uh, I wasn't tilted, or I tried not to be tilted, but we started off with another e4 opening, e4, and then recently I've been doing a lot in the Alekhines defense, so I played knight f6, and the main response is e5, knight d5, d4, d6, and a very aggressive line, which I don't think I've really seen very often, f4, and then takes on e5, takes on e5, and c5. So to this point, these are all played perfectly. I wasn't 100% sure what to do here. I was familiar with the lines of d6 and uh, knight f3, which is the main one here. But after this, you might think, okay, why not just play the bishop out? Why not play e6? I would love to do that, but we don't want white to build up the strong center. So c5 is strong because it immediately questions the center, immediately it breaks the center, and forces a response from white, which knight f3, best move, c takes d4, and knight takes d4, which is not as accurate as queen takes d4, but already this position is equal for both sides. It's already equal, and we play the Alekhines system. So to get this position right away was definitely a victory for me for being able to do this out of the Alekhines defense, just easily equalizes black, and since white didn't play perfectly right now, I have a slight edge, very slight edge. And I played e6, just stabilizing the knight in the center. This is a good move, even though you would want to play the bishop out, but there's nowhere for this bishop to go. So to get ready to castle, unfortunately, I have to get this bishop out, and I'm not going to take the time to play g6 here. So a logical move is just to play e6 to port the knight, get ready to move the bishop to e7, and then get on with development. So e6 stabilizes the knight, bishop g3, normal development. That's normally where white wants to put their bishop in the Alekhines, and you can see both the bishops are attacking toward the king side, so they look very good, and they have more space because they have the e5 pawn. So all in all, this position is still slightly equal. There's lots of dynamic chances for both sides. And I played an interesting move, but not the best move, queen b6. And there might have been another move, knight d7, that's what the computer gives here in this position, or other moves. But queen b6 is very sharp. The idea is just simply attacking the pawn, or the knight on d4, and if the bishop moves, the pawn on b2. So it's questioning black or white. What are you going to do? What you going to do in this position? White solidified the knight with the move c3 and bishop c5. And already we have a position that's only been reached about once or twice in a game before. And so this is a very, very new line. In the other line, I'll show you after queen g4. In the other game, the move was knight d2, which is actually a really good move. And if the game continued just like it continued in that other game, after bishop d4, not c takes d4, but actually knight c4 double exclam. A very powerful move. Counterattacking the queen, not worried about recapturing, not worried about the threat of bishop f2 check, or the counter threat which the computer gives is knight takes on c3, attacks the queen. And so it's a very complicated, messy position. But at the end of the line, we have knight into d6 check. And even though right now white is down a piece, this position is very complicated and it's actually messy, and white's the one that comes out on top. But white was also being hyper aggressive and played queen g4. And if you notice, all my pieces seem to be away from the king side, except for that rook, and the g7 pawn is really weak. So the computer actually gives castling in this position, but with these bishops staring at you in the face, and that open f file right there, and all the pieces on the queen side, you would have to see this position perfectly and be like, okay, I will be okay. But it takes some serious skill to know that you can castle this way and still be okay. So instead of doing that, I just played king f8, which is scary still. I mean, the king is not castled, but I was thinking maybe I can get the rook into the game with just playing h5, or at least I can bring my pieces back and start to protect me on the queen side. And even though the center is sort of open, if we can trade off enough pieces, hopefully I can neutralize the attack. So white castled, logical. Um, the rook is now putting pressure on f7, and these pieces are still looking at the king. So knight d7 just developing, but also attacking the pawn on e5. And white, in a rush to finish the development and get the knight into the game, played king h1 just to get the king out of the way of this deadly pin with the bishop and queen on c5 and b6. But the problem with that move is it allows counterplay with knight takes e5. And now a couple moves back in this position, already black is under some pressure and it gives white a slight edge. And after this, it says that white is almost 2 pawns up, or 2 points advantage. But after this series of moves, already knight d7, it says that it's equal. And after this move, it says that black is ahead 0.8. So we've already gone from white being better, white being equal, to black being slightly better. And of course, that's what the computer says, but because of the fact that the king is still very weak over here on f8, objectively speaking, this is still slightly equal, but still complicated. But black's doing okay, and at the moment, we are a pawn up, so we're doing well. So knight retreated, or queen retreated to g3. Knight takes d3. It's always good. With that move, it also double attacked the queen and the bishop. And now that that bishop is out of the way, black is definitely breathing a sigh of relief, because one of the strong attackers of the h7 square and the f7 square was gone now, and the other pieces still have not developed yet. So if black can get their pieces out, can trade as many pieces as possible, everything seems good, and he should be doing good with the extra pawn, especially since they have a pass pawn in the center. So everything all in all looks good for black. And so good that I figured it was time to go for a queen trade and just simplify into the better position. Queen a6. Computer doesn't like the move. Says that it's not the right time to offer trade queens. But after c4, and after c4, white is back in the game again, slightly. It's just slightly better for white, slightly. But after knight b4, queen f3, f6 is actually the only move to stop the threat of mate. And luckily, the bishop and queen are defending the e6 pawn. So things are still messy, but I have a threat of knight c2, hopefully, or hoping I can get that threat if I can just take a second to capture the bishop, the knight that's hanging. And black retreated the knight to b3, which at the same time allows me to play knight to c2, which you shouldn't do because the bishop's hanging and then the queen's going to be hanging. So instead, first retreat the bishop to e7, which adds another defender to the f6 pawn, and then knight a3 defending the c2 square. So now queen c6, computer gives this as an inaccuracy again, saying, hey, it's not the right time to trade queens. But I think this is a very interesting move because it baits white into trading queens, and this time white actually accepts it, which is a big time blunder, which positionally, which it doesn't seem so at first sight. But after knight takes, if you look at the position, there's 4 pawns on the king side for black, 2 pawns on the queen side versus 2 on the king side and 3 on the queen side. We're still up a pawn. We have an endgame where white is probably not going to be getting any more chances to attack black's king, in spite of the fact that the rook is still stuck for the time being on h8, and the other rook has not moved from a8. But likewise, white's rook hasn't moved from a1 as well. So trading queens is not good in that position. It's not normally good to trade queens when you're down material, and also when having a queen is pretty much your only advantage of the attack or a perpetual check. So at this point, computer gives negative 3.7 or 3.7 for black, so it says that black is pretty much has a winning advantage. A6, I had to calculate carefully because, for instance, knight c7, I was a little worried about this move, but after rook b8 and f4, luckily I have the move e5, and the knight defends the pawn on e5. Otherwise, because of this pin, the bishop could just take, but luckily the knight is on c6. So after a6, however, white retreated the knight to c3. Bishop d7, interesting move. The computer won it. Knight e5, which happens on the next move anyway. But now most of the pieces are out in the game. Both rooks are ready to come into the game. This rook can go to the d file or e file, wherever it's needed. And with h5, it was multi-purpose. The idea is to push the pawn as far as possible and disrupt those two pawns. And that will destroy not only the king's position, try to prevent all the counterplay that white would have on the queen side when it comes to moving pawns whatsoever. There's not any hope of minority attack because of the fact that there's 2 pawns against 4, plus that's where the king is. So that in mind of forcing the king side open, but also if you push the pawn enough, this rook on the h file is going to be able to get active via the h file versus coming through this end of the board. So interesting move. Computer doesn't like it, but still, we're still sitting at negative 4.3. Black is still have a winning advantage, and especially after h3, which positional mistake. e5 it gives instead of h3, it says rook f4, which would have put pressure on the knight. But okay, you still are questioning, okay, well, what happens? You just still push this pawn after the knight moves. I mean, it still doesn't seem great for white at all. But h3 weakens the king side even further, and later on you'll see how that plays into effect. Now, h4, again, not the exact right move. We're not playing engines all the time, so we don't always play accurately. The computer thinks that the absolute perfect move was e5 here, which stops the knights from coming in and preventing all kinds of counterplay. But h4 is still a sensible, good move, and we're still ahead. So knight d4. The problem with that move is the bishop takes on c5, and now there is no hope. We have 2 pawns on the king side, or queen side, and king side, but there's also 2 pawns for myself on the queen side. So 2 pawns against 2 pawns, versus if you look at the queen side, there's 4 pawns against 2. So right now we're sitting 2 pawns up. Both our bishops are active in the center. We've got the bishop pair, and we have equal material otherwise besides the 2 pawns up. So black is doing completely fine, completely crushing advantage, and white has nothing very much in this position. And so I go to trade more pieces, and white is able to get both the rooks into the game, and I retreat back to a7, which seems a little bit weird, but it's getting the king out, and at the same time, sort of a sniper hidden back there, safe from the knights, but also controlling that whole diagonal. And the knight comes in. These knights are going to be annoying. Taking advantage right now of the pin, but I can't take it because the rook on f1 is protecting, but at the same time it's putting pressure on e6. So I relieve that pressure with rook e8. Then the other knight comes in with a threat maybe of knight d6 or somewhere. Knights just like to go lots of places. So I played king e7, which indirectly attacks the knight because there's no longer a pin. So the knight gets back. And here I realize I have a very good move, which I didn't actually see them move before, but it's okay. King e7 was a really good move because of the fact that it attacks the knight. But had to stop and think for a second here. Right now we both have about 4 minutes on the clock, and I take about 30 seconds or so to think clearly about the next move, and it just happens to be bishop b5. And if you take a closer look at the rook on f1, there's actually nowhere for it to go. Because of this other bishop here, if the rook were to go to g1, it would just be taken. So in fact, this is the time for black to give up the bishop pair in view of winning the exchange. So the other rook went to c1, which is kind of scary. At first I was thinking, okay, after this move, you're not thinking of rook c7, right? And I started worrying, okay, is there something here? But quite simply, after just king d8, attacking the bishop, attacking the rook, if rook takes on b7, just rook e7, and the bishop is preventing the rook from coming in. So the rook would have to go back or trade, but this is already bad because this bishop can't be taken, and so black would just be totally winning. So instead, white didn't even go for that line. White just decided to take on f1, and then from here, there's not much to say except white tried but couldn't prevent any counter, or couldn't prevent anything from happening. And king d7, the last effort to keep the rook from coming down and infiltrating. So in this position, white played the losing move, rook c4. And again, if I look at the timestamp, I practically blitzed out g5 and immediately realized, okay, wait, there's probably something I missed here. Luckily for me, white also missed it and played a5. And if you want to stop here and see if you can find a winning plan for black, it's a little complicated to see because of the geometry of it, but it's a very nice plan. It starts with rook d1 check, and at this point white can resign because the only move is king h2, bishop g1 check, only move is king h1, bishop f2 check, the most accurate retreat, king can only go to h2, and bishop g3 is actually checkmate. So beautiful mate, had this a move ago, but didn't see it because again blitzed out the move g5, intending on protecting this pawn. So a lot of players, whenever they see a piece attacked, or they want to prevent something, let's say g3 or g4, they forget about what's the most important thing, and the most important thing is checkmate or winning the game on the spot. So instead of rushing, again, I have 2 minutes 40 seconds in a crush position. I should have just thought carefully and played what was played in the game afterwards, rook d1, and gone for mate. And again, if let's say white had seen it after g5, black would have played something like g3, which it's still hopeless. There's still very little that white can do, but there's a difference between -10 and after this move, mate and 4. Like, there's nothing more winning than checkmate. So, and luckily I found it the next move. So, hope you enjoyed that game. Some of the lessons from looking at these games: number one, play simple chess. Just play simple moves. Don't try to be complicated. Don't try to get crazy, unless it's called for. Sometimes it is good to get into a tactical craziness just so that you can survive, especially if you're not doing too well, or if you feel like you know the position better than your opponent, or you have lots of time to calculate and they have less time. Sometimes it's good to complicate things. But play simple chess. Play the best moves. Try to take your time and calculate, and especially don't be hasty. Number two, take extra time when you're winning. A lot of times when you're winning, your opponent can come up with some counterplay or come up with some tricks that can make the position last longer. For instance, back here, if white had seen the threat of checkmate, they might have played something else that would have extended the game even longer. But instead, I should have just played the most accurate rook d1 right away, which would have eliminated all counterplay, and that would have been fine. And in the first game that we saw, uh, there was a stalemate which could have been avoided if I had just simply fought for 10 seconds and seen that those pawns can't move and the king's going to be stalemated. So White's going to do that a lot, or the opponent's going to do that a lot whenever you're winning. They're going to try to make it as hard as possible. They're going to try to flag you. They're trying to win on time. They're going to do their hardest not to lose. So even more when you're winning, you have to take time to make sure you play the best moves. And make sure the easiest way to do that is when you have a question position, if you have enough time, try to find every single move that the opponent can think of as a defense, because trust me, they're going to find it, because they're right now in a position where they have to um, find it. So watch out for those defenses, because they're going to find it because they're desperate. Watch out for stalemate motives. If your opponent's pawns are immobile, as they were in the first game, be extra careful. Use your time and don't fall into the trap of looking at your opponent and being like, okay, why don't you resign already? This is embarrassing. This is terrible. Let me just rush. And since my opponent was blitzing out moves in the first game, I just wanted to blitz out moves as well and show them that nope, I don't need to think about this. I can get you down right now, and lo and behold, stalemate. So watch out for that. And finally, don't always resign. Don't give up. Sometimes there's ways out of the situation. A lot of times you can find stalemate. Sometimes just playing it out will be better for you in the long run, so you can learn more. Um, but especially when you're just down, um, as in both games. Like for instance, the first game, White was better according to the computer. Said 3 or 5 advantage, but that's not something that um, you know intuitively. You still have to prove that. So don't resign too early, especially if there's a way out or if you can complicate things. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.